Hi everyone, and welcome back to this episode of Crime Beat Conversations. I'm your host, Rafaella Lipschitz, and today I'm so excited to be joined by Mark Shaw. Mark is the director of the Global Initiative for Transnational Organized Crime, and every 2 years, GTOC releases the Organized Crime Index. This is an index that measures countries' criminality and resilience to organized crime. And today we're going to be looking at the most recent results from the 2025 index, looking at some of the trends and patterns that have emerged, any surprises, and what the implications of these results are. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining me today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So, Mark, I want to start off by looking at some of the actors and the actor profiles.
Yeah.
One of the things that the index showed was that the presence of foreign actors grew the most.
Yeah.
You know, these are criminal actors that are operating outside of their home country.
Yeah.
Can you explain why we've seen such a sharp growth in these actors?
It's a really good question, Rafaela. I think what has happened over the course of us doing the index is that foreign actors' criminality has moved and grown, perhaps more rapidly than we had anticipated when we began designing the index. We knew, of course, in the last 3 decades of the globalization of crime, that foreign criminal actors were driving that. But what's so surprising, if you also look at the data about who they are, is their diversity, the degree to which there are new and emerging actors, and the reality that it's a very rapidly evolving picture. And to answer your question is quite challenging. I think what's happened is that a lot of people have moved, either been pushed out by law enforcement or gone out to seek their fortune, or made agreements or arrangements with local criminal groups. And what was reported back country by country is just this growth of foreign criminal actors. It's an increase from the last sweep of the index. It's not a huge increase, but it's a noticeable increase, and you can see over the periods in which we've been running the index how it's continued to grow. I think it's very significant. One thing where we feel we need to do more work is to identify more clearly, country by country, the nationalities of the people involved. And I think that's what we are trying to do for the next round. So a greater focus on actors and who they are. As you know, the index is a massive data collection exercise. And we are, in each sweep, trying to improve the quality of the data and then dig into areas like this one, where people have a particular interest.
Great, thank you. And another question on the actors, something else that I found interesting in the index was the growth of the private sector's involvement in illicit economies. You know, we tend to think about the private sector more so as targets or victims of organized crime. What does their role in these illicit markets look like, and why do you think we're seeing a growth in their prevalence?
I mean, what's interesting about the private sector category for us is, as I think you know, we initially didn't have a private sector category. And when the index first came out, some of the comments we got was that we needed to add one, and we did. And you can see private sector actors are significant contributors to organized crime. Who are they? It's basically private companies, and it's a very big spectrum, right? People involved in illicit forestry, the Wagner Group. It's really a very wide spectrum. Private sector actors engaged in criminal activity, and when the teams are doing the reviews, in particular countries, that's prominent. Many of them would be engaged in corrupt activities with the state. They are protected by state actors and the like. They have, if you like, a commercial front, but they often carry out illicit activities. So the question is, well, is that an organized crime group? Well, it meets the definition in that it's organized, it operates over time, it makes profit from illicit activities, can engage in violence and corruption. So it fits the category very, very well. In addition, a lot of private sector actors are engaged in facilitating organized crime. So the analysts were looking for that as well, whether that's in the property sphere, the legal sphere, banking sphere, and the like. And then that is measured country by country. But it is quite a stark finding in the index. I agree, but that's where the data is drawn from.
So, Mark, something that also always interests me in the index is the sort of quadrants of countries and the pairs that they have between criminality and resilience. And there's this sort of unique set of countries, very few of them, that fall into the high resilience but high criminality quadrant. You know, South Africa, for example, our home country, Colombia, I saw, was in that quadrant this time. What explains that, and what are some of the opportunities and challenges that these countries face?
It's a really good question, I have to say. There's 9 countries there. The first point to make about them, which is interesting in terms of the conclusion overall of the index, is that they're all democracies. They're kind of contested democracies, right? And none of them are perfect, some more than others. So they are democracies with high levels of, or high-ish or comparatively high levels of organized crime. They are sort of distributed in that matrix across a relatively wide spectrum, but they have high levels of resilience. And what is resilience in the terminology of the index? It's the institutional capacity to respond. So law enforcement, a judiciary system that has, it may have corruption, but it has still capacity, a free media, civil society actors who are willing to speak out. And so that resilience and high levels of organized crime mean that in all of those countries, there's a visible fight between the institutional capacity of the state holistically and levels of organized crime. And take our own country, I think that's a very useful way of describing it. It's messy. The media is essential. There are police successes, but there's high levels of corruption. There are the judiciary is regarded as relatively independent, but there's also evidence of corruption within the judiciary. So this real fight between criminality and the resilience of the state. The same is true of Colombia. There are a number of what are described as developed states there. France is there. The United States is actually just within that box. It's not as far along as countries like South Africa and Colombia, but I would say those countries are really where the great contest between what you might call illicit markets and organized crime and the resilience of the state. And in places like Colombia and South Africa, the success of the institutional and societal response to organized crime will, in my view, determine the success of the state, its ability to deliver public goods, its ability to protect its people. So those countries are hugely interesting. I really want to emphasize that they are all democracies. And that gives them added resilience in our reading, because the index shows that democracies are much more effective in the longer term at responding to organized crime. And one reason for that is that they have self-corrective mechanisms. Again, to take the South African example, but it applies in a number of others, is that independent media, democratic systems pick up problems within the institutional response. Those are made public. It has real political implications, and there's a kind of cyclical response. Is it perfect? No, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it's much better than states where there are weak institutions, authoritarian rule, which takes over criminal markets. So I think those sets of states in the index are, you are right, I think they're very interesting. They have commonalities, they have differences. They are often the states that are worth writing about when you're looking about how the fight against organized crime is taking place.
I want to switch now to Venezuela, if we can, with obviously so much attention on it at the moment. It's interesting that the index shows that Venezuela has a high level of criminal actors from every sort of profile, state embedded, mafia groups, foreign criminal actors, like we were discussing
Yeah.
earlier. What does this sort of actor profile tell us or signal to us now that Maduro has been captured and Venezuela is in some sort of new stage in its political outlook?
I mean, Venezuela in the index is, well, of course, the index was done before the capture of Maduro. What it shows very clearly is it's part of a, unfortunately, relatively large number of states, but still, it's part of this of states that have a very high reading for state penetration by criminal groups. So, which essentially means that there are state actors protecting a wide diversity of criminal markets. And in the context of Venezuela, that's gold. Illicit gold mining is a huge issue. It's drugs, to some degree, it's environmental crime, etc. It doesn't do as badly as other countries in terms of the spread of criminal markets. There are others that are worse, the DRC, Brazil, South Africa, etc. And as you know, there's a weighting in the index against states that have a very, very diverse set of criminal markets. But it's right up there in terms of state penetration, or what we term state-embedded actors. And why is that? Well, the assessment was that the state is deeply involved in protecting and controlling criminality. Now, when you read the Venezuela profile, and to come to answer your question, the profile is not saying that all criminality was controlled by the president. The profile makes the point that that different sets of state actors, the military, other political actors, policy actors, have a big role in protecting different criminal markets. If you remove the top of that, the sort of mediator, there's bound to be some important changes in the criminal markets of Venezuela. It's probably too early to tell, but it does mean that the system and the ecosystem that controlled and protected criminal markets is changing and will change. And of course, the next index is in 2 years' time. I think we will get some sense of whether or not the resilience or fragility of Venezuela has increased. But I think you can say that there's likely to be greater contestation and fragmentation between the criminal groups involved. A lot, of course, depends on what the United States does, its relationship between change within the Venezuelan state. If there is a change overall in governance, I mean, democracy, etc., I think there's no doubt that criminal markets will be involved in looking for influence protection, and shaping those issues. Venezuela is interesting for another reason, that the military is deeply involved. So it's one of these cases where the security institutions themselves are the mechanisms of protection. It's not like one or two other states. North Korea is a very dramatic example of that in the index, where the state has absolute control over all criminal markets, but there's definitely a high level of control. People benefit from it individually. When that system cracks or changes, there's bound to be some form of contestation, I think, between different actors that are present there.
Lastly, I want to end on what surprised you about the results from this index, things that you maybe weren't necessarily expecting, things that are both, we can be more optimistic about, but also things that we should carefully watch for.
I must say, perhaps the most surprising, I'll be very candid. I was hoping for some improvements. And by improvements, I was hoping that we would be able to show greater resilience in some parts of the world and declining levels of criminality. And genuinely, I was surprised that we couldn't. That actually the picture remains relatively bleak. And the overall picture is, to summarize it, is quite a simple one. Resilience has remained largely static and has declined in some places, which means that states' ability to respond to organized crime has not improved. There's some exceptions to that. Albania, for example, I would say is probably the good news story and Albania has often been seen as clearly a platform for organized crime, but there's some improvements there in resilience and response. But those examples are really, there are very, very few of them. And then tied to that is the overall growth of criminality. So that to me was a surprise, because I was hoping, in discussions like this, to say things are looking better in some parts of the world and worse in others, but the general picture remains relatively poor. In that, I suppose the additional surprise was the degree to which financial crime and cybercrime, perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise, are just prevalent in the vast majority of countries. Now, whether or not people consider this organized crime in a pure sense, it's highly organized. We think, for example, the level of fraud is a result of scam centers and the sort of industrial level of fraud that now dominates the global market. And you can see that coming through the results. But the surprise is how pervasive it is across countries. And that's why fraud comes out as the most prevalent global crime. So it's a mix of that really surprised me. I'm no longer surprised, because what the big surprise when we first did the index was, wow, the reality is that organized crime penetration of states around the world is super dramatic, right? You have it was like, well, states are kind of vectors in the global criminal ecosystem. In this case, we've talked of Venezuela, but there are many examples. That's no longer a surprise. I think that was the big shock of the first one, the level to which there was an assessment that states around the world in various forms protected criminal activity, benefited from criminal activity, were important criminal actors in their own right. Maybe I've got cynical. That has increased as well, but that was less of a surprise than this, I think, frustrating reality that the policy options in our response against the diversity of organized criminal markets and actors that we face has not improved.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. Sorry to end on that worrying note, but I really appreciate you being here and speaking with me today.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of Crime Beat Conversations. Please be sure to stay tuned for more, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.